So in my response video to counter-arguments, I talked about how I stopped watching videos on YouTube for a few years, and when I came back I was hungry for some good skeptic content, since it would be incorrect to call a lot of the videos made by atheists around these parts good, or skeptical, or even content. Really? One of the first channels I came across during this time was Rationality Rules, run by a vegan Viking-looking dude named Stephen Woodford. You may have heard about him. He's been at the center of a split in the atheist community after a, and this is a monumental understatement, poorly made video. I'll talk about it towards the end, but I won't be directly responding to it. The goddamn fantastic channel Essence of Thought has thoroughly covered this whole debacle. They were really the first to call Woodford out and have made a series of videos that are the definitive rebuttal to his shitty takes, and they received quite a lot of harassment for it too. In all seriousness, they are much, much better than me, and you should absolutely pause this video on Woodford and go watch theirs. I'm not kidding. Do it. But please come back, I need you. Alright, we'll touch on this controversy, but for now, this video is going to go back to the long-forgotten era of 2018. Actually, we'll have to go back a little further than that, back to when I first discovered Rationality Rules in the great golden age of 2017. Back then, he only had a handful of videos where he debunked classic creationist arguments like Pascal's wager and irreducible complexity, you know, solid boilerplate atheist shit. He's always had a slick production style, and he was putting out exactly the kind of videos that I enjoyed back in the day, so I eagerly consumed every video he put out. But then something different happened. As soon as I saw this video, it set off alarm bells in my head, and I think this, along with his work leading up to and including his current issues, are indicative of how he approaches information and comes to conclusions, particularly in the realm of politics. In April of 2017, he stepped out of his wheelhouse and put out this video, Is the Left Eating Itself?, in which he gives his 2 cents on a panel of the same name that was not about Marxist cannibals, as you might think, but about that age-old gem of free speech on college campuses. This seems to be a subject I'll have to touch on more than once. Now, on its face, this is not an unreasonable subject to have a discussion about. However, is the left eating itself as a question is, well, leading as fuck. It's a framing that's so often used by disingenuous people that if you've spent any amount of time in leftist spaces online, you've surely seen it used as a joke. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's actually watch the video. As always, I suggest you watch Stephen's video first so you can tell me how I took him out of context. I would also suggest watching the full panel. It is somewhat interesting if you actually know the background of the host organizations and the panel members, because that is relevant, and I'm going to get into that here. Okay, let's do this. Yeah, we didn't get far. George Orwell never said this. You know who did? A fellow by the name of Selwyn Duke, a frothing-at-the-mouth reactionary going by his Twitter in the few articles I read. He wrote this in an article in 2009 that was a defense of Michael Savage, real name Michael Weiner, never forget, who had just been banned from entering the UK because he is also a frothing-at-the-mouth reactionary, and I would know because he was one of those right-wing talk radio hosts that I grew up with. If you look him up, he'll read things. Oh, it's funny because the fascists are back. Anyway, it's interesting to note that in the original article, the word truth is capitalized. Selwyn does this a lot, though not in the headline of the article, but that's just journalistic style, baby. Given what he and Mr. Weiner have in common, I think it's pretty easy to figure out what he means by capital T truth, and I don't think it's the same truth that noted atheist Stephen Woodford was thinking about. Funny how context can change things like that. Let this be a lesson to everyone. Before you use a quote, type it into Google.
On the 27th of November 2017, Spiked magazine hosted a debate titled Is the Left Eating Itself? And within it, Laura Kipnis, Angus Johnston and Brendan O'Neill argued that it's not, while Brett Weinstein argued that it is.
Okay, so let's break all this down. Yeah, we'll get to Brett Weinstein in a second. Let's talk about the hosts first. The YouTube channel is Learn Liberty, which is sort of like PragerU if Dennis Prager had an iota, but just an iota, of shame. It's run by the Institute for Humane Studies, which was founded by an Austrian school economist named F.A. Harper with the help of notorious fellow Austrian school economist Friedrich Hayek. Charles Koch sits on the board, Rand Paul has fundraised for them. Basically, they're libertarian as fuck. Spiked Magazine has an interesting history. They were originally called Living Marxism, which was a magazine started by the Revolutionary Communist Party in the UK. They were a bit weird, but they were Trotskyists, so weirdness comes with the territory. Honestly, I can't pretend like I understand far-left politics in the UK. What is clear is that in the 90s, the magazine took a bit of a right-wing shift. Ah, our old friend, the 90s. The party disbanded in 97 and the magazine kept on going until they lost a libel suit, which was its own can of worms, and it bankrupted the magazine in the Y2K. In 2001, it came back as the new Spiked Magazine, took a further shift to the right, and last year it was revealed that they're funded, at least partially, by Charles Koch. So basically, they're libertarian as fuck, but they don't want you to know that. Now, if you trust a couple of libertarian organizations to present you a discussion of the left in good faith, then I have a bridge in Brooklyn to sell you. Lightly used, only 136 years old. So, what sorts of characters do you think they got to participate in this? Let's start with Bret Weinstein, a member of the so-called intellectual dark web, a name that is both pretentious and dumb, since the dark web is where people go to hire hitmen from FBI agents. Bret Weinstein has some personal experience with the topic at hand. Long story short, he was vigorously protested at the Evergreen State College campus here in Washington, where he taught over his take on a suggested change to the annual Day of Absence event there. This was a day where students and faculty of color would all leave campus and meet elsewhere to discuss relevant issues while using their absence to highlight the importance of their presence. Pretty cool tradition, if you ask me. However, in 2017, it was suggested that the white students and faculty should be absent instead, which was about 75% of the population there. Now, to me, a white-dominated space being given up to be dominated by people of color is a pretty innocuous piece of an attempt at restorative justice. But to Professor Weinstein, this was a show of force and an act of oppression in and of itself. I feel like I should state once again that this was a suggestion, not a requirement. I'm sure plenty of students of color either chose not to or simply couldn't afford to participate in the Day of Absence, and if you think that all 3,000 plus white students were going to just stay in their dorms and get high, then, well, they might. The thing that I'm about 99% sure that set everyone at him was that he went on to say, if there was interest in a public presentation and discussion of race through a scientific/evolutionary lens, I would be quite willing to organize such an event. Now, setting aside the fact that he offered himself up as some sort of race expert, to your average curious white dude on the street, a discussion of the science of race sounds interesting. Maybe even a little enlightening. But to a person of color, it sounds more like,
as you can see, the skull of the Negro features several protrusions and areas associated with aggression and lustfulness, and therefore we can conclude that they share a closer relation to our ape ancestors.
As an evolutionary biologist, I'm sure that Bret is aware that his own field has been historically chock full of some really fucking racist ideas. Ideas that did not just go away once the Civil Rights Act was signed. And the people who came up with those ideas weren't wrong because they were racist. I mean, they were wrong about that too, but they were wrong because race isn't biological. I mean, we're not imagining that black folks have darker skin and are more likely to get sickle cell anemia, but those things aren't really race. Race is socially constructed. Just hear me out. And is based on the idea that you are either white or one of those other races. Everyone from Nazis to the SJWs, while varying wildly on its implications, frames it this way, because that's how it functions in our society. Who is and isn't white changes all the time, and framing it as something biological or genetic is to imply that race is something hard-coded and intrinsic. And when Professor Weinstein called for others to put phenotype aside, he was pulling a double whammy of misrepresenting what race actually is and dismissing the very real inequities between white folks and people of color. Basically, protests erupted. He was told by the administration that he should stay away from campus for his own safety. The school was shut down for a bit. He resigned, sued Evergreen, went on all the cable news shows, and then joined up with a gang of pseudo-intellectual dickweeds. Was this all a dogpile of overreactions? Maybe. The fuck do I know? I do know that Evergreen is a weird-ass place, though. I have friends who went there, and this one time in the dorms, I literally watched a guy try to use a fish that he pulled out of the river with his bare hands to barter for some hash. A real, whole fucking fish. And since I know you're gonna ask, no, it didn't work. My friend was vegetarian. Now, arguing against the leftist auto-cannibalism, we have Brendan O'Neill, who is the editor for Spiked magazine. Here's some of the things he's written. He said that people who are abused by Jimmy Savile should shut the fuck up. He engages in climate change denial. He called Greta Thunberg, the 16-year-old climate activist with Asperger's, a millenarian weirdo and calls environmentalism a cult. He even opposes gay marriage and has the fucking temerity to claim that he is on the left. If this guy is on the left, then the fucking polls must have reversed because the political compass is backwards. Yeah, he started off at a magazine called Living Marxism, but he pulls that Marx actually loved capitalism shit, which means that the only charitable way to view him is that he's an idiot. Otherwise, he'd be purposefully misrepresenting Marx. But I think it's far more likely that he's just hiding his power level. His opening statement on the panel literally makes him sound like a version of Milo Yiannopoulos that lacks charisma and acknowledges the existence of class. Next up, we have Laura Kipnis. Now, the sense I get from Professor Kipnis is that, while definitely a mixed bag, she seems like she's acting in good faith here, and a lot of what she says on the panel, I actually agree with. However, she is certainly here because she has a contentious critique of Title IX of the Education Amendments Act, which prohibits discrimination based on sex at institutions that receive public funding. And she has her own "I've been protested" story to go along with it. So here's what happened. She wrote an essay in 2015 titled "Sexual Paranoia Strikes Academe?" Look, just say academia. In it, she makes some fucking wild claims about the changes to Title IX in 2014, which she refers to as the Great Prohibition. Yes, the pretentious language continues into the essay. Basically, updates to Title IX required schools, hers included, to update their policies on sexual and romantic relationships between individuals at the school where there is an imbalance of power. Or, more succinctly, don't fuck your students. If you do, you have to report it. If you break the rules, you could get fired. It's the sort of rules change that makes you think, oh, wait, those weren't already the rules? Anyway, in her essay, she waxes melodramatic about the possible consequences of the changes, recalls a story from a voluntary sexual harassment course that I'm about 90% sure didn't happen, and then paints very credible sexual assault accusations against her fellow professor Peter Ludlow, and the resulting lawsuits from it and Northwestern University's attempt to sweep it under the rug, as melodrama in a demonstration of a disgusting lack of self-awareness. Yeah, people were pissed. They called for the university to affirm its new policy and condemn her statements, which is definitely the bare minimum. 2 Title IX complaints were brought against her, one for having a chilling effect on victims' ability to come forward, and one for retaliation because, again, she publicly dismissed credible sexual assault accusations as melodrama. She was, for the record, cleared by the university. Before I move on, I do want to point out one little thing. Sexual harassment updates weren't the only or even the biggest change to Title IX in 2014. The big change was that it was expanded to include transgender folks. Now, I'm not saying that her coming out against the changes to Title IX means that she was opposed to all the changes. In fact, she even says that trans rights are not up for debate in her opening statement. But hey, maybe it has something to do with the reason why Learn Liberty and Dave Rubin want her to keep coming on their shows to talk shit about Title IX. I don't know, because I could not bring myself to watch her appearances on the Rubin Report. Just imagining listening to those two lukewarm intelligences drone on about ideas. I can't do it. And that brings us to Angus Johnston. This guy fucks. Kidding aside, he's exactly the kind of person you should have on this side of this debate. He's a historian and advocate for student activism, so much so that his Twitter handle is @studentactivism, and his blog is studentactivism.net. He has a number of articles and appearances where he advocates for trigger warnings and lowering the voting age and talks about the history of student activism, and he even gives away stickers that say "Fight Fascism" for free. This is my guy. Also, he's got some pretty good Twitter game too. I started following him after researching this. Oh, and before you accuse me of going soft on Angus and not the others, let me stop you. There's not really a comparison. This guy is prolific, but small potatoes compared to the others. He has no big controversies to his name, and while I probably could comb through his writing and find something problematic, I'd like this video to be under 50 minutes this time. Moving on!
These days, claims that the left are falling apart are absolutely everywhere. Hell, you need only watch a single YouTube video of Ben Shapiro for the algorithm to incessantly suggest such titles as Ben Shapiro destroys leftist, Jordan Peterson destroys leftist host, and Milo Yiannopoulos destroys emotional liberal. But do you know what? As much as it originally surprised me, in many cases these videos do actually deliver. The people within them that represent the left and the arguments that they use are often embarrassingly poor. But here's the thing, these people, these arguments, they're not liberal, at least not in the classical sense, but I'll get back to that point later.
It should in no way surprise you that Ben Shapiro, an experienced speaker who has been a conservative political operative since he was 17, expert of false dichotomies and the Gish Gallop, and person who has the audience on their side, is able to dance around a question posed by some random college student. If you came upon a video titled Ben Shapiro Destroys Leftist and thought you were in for an even-handed, sprightly debate, then you don't know Ben Shapiro.
Love him or loathe him, I'm sure you'll agree with me when I say that Ben Shapiro is one of the greatest debaters around. He's intelligent, quick-witted, excellent at avoiding distractions, is amply armed with references, and, of course, he wields some fantastic one-liners.
Oh, good lord. Vosh, can I borrow you for a minute?
Yes, you never, ever, 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 ever want to challenge a reactionary while they have the podium and you don't, while they have the audience and you don't. As if they are even slightly intelligent, it is literally impossible for them to lose in the eye of their audience. It is not possible. This is why you don't argue with reactionaries when they have the podium and you don't. So he had got a bunch of time to speak where he laid out a very calm point. Ben got a bunch of time to speak where he then said a bunch of shit that had nothing to do with the kid's argument but misled the audience, and then deliberately misinterpreted what the kid was saying to present a straw man the kid would then have to correct. And now this kid has 18,000 fucking misconceptions that he has to correct, which he'll never be able to, not in a fucking million years. And now when he speaks up, Ben is going to keep hammering this in, deliberately interrupting the kid, forcing him to answer misleading questions. This is how you win a Ben Shapiro debate. You get the mic, you deliberately misinterpret what they say, you throw straw men at them and force them to defend or respond to that, both of which are impossible, and then, just to keep them off base, you continue to interrupt them while they're responding to your points. It's a very, very simple formula to follow if you are intellectually dishonest and a complete fucking cunt.
Thanks, Vosh. Please don't copyright strike me. And Stephen, liberals aren't leftists. But you're right. Let's table that for now.
For now, here's Brett explaining his position.
For the moment, what I want to do is suggest a kind of approach to understanding why this really is the left that is attacking some of us who all our lives would have called ourselves leftists. And the first thing I would suggest is that we may have a basic problem with the game theory of progressivism. It is quite possible that what is taking place is that the left has a bad actor problem. What I'm witnessing in the present are bad actors that have control over the entire dialogue, and that is a very dangerous situation.
Gotta love how we went from praising the likes of Ben Shapiro and Milo Yiannopoulos to stating in bold letters across the screen that the left has a bad actor problem.
So, is Brett correct here? Or, to ask this question obliquely, when Brett criticised Evergreen for requesting that all white students and staff not attend campus for the day, did the left endorse those who called for his resignation? Was it left-endorsed actors who prevented Brendan from participating in an abortion debate simply because he doesn't have a vagina? Did Kathy Newman really represent the left when she implied that Jordan's right to free speech comes second to someone else's right not to be offended? Do the left really endorse the authors, journalists, and news outlets that call Sam Harris and Douglas Murray a racist simply because they're concerned by the number of Muslims that support punishing homosexuals?
I've already talked about the evergreen shit, so I won't go into that again. The Brendan O'Neill thing is something that he is wildly misrepresenting. This was to be a debate put on at Oxford by the anti-choice group Oxford Students for Life, and as you can see in the video, was to be about whether or not abortion culture hurts us all, which is the most disingenuous framing I've heard since Is the Left Eating Itself? Brendan O'Neill was to be arguing against the premise, while Tim Stanley of The Telegraph was to argue in favor. Pro-choice protesters successfully pushed to have it shut down, in part because, yes, two cisgender right-wing men debating abortion is lacking in a certain perspective. One might say, correctly, the most important perspective. Which is not to say that cis dudes can't debate this, just that it's fucked up for them to be the only ones engaged in it. But, even if one of them did have a bajingo, the entire premise of the debate is a bit telling. What the fuck is abortion culture? Women's bodily autonomy is not a cultural issue, and in my opinion, and the opinion of protesters and anyone with a soul, is not up for debate. As for the Jordan Peterson interview, Kathy Newman did a shit job, can't lie. What they were talking about was the whole fake thing the Lobster Man came up with about the Canadian government forcing people to use trans folks' preferred pronouns. It was really just an extension of civil rights protections to trans people. Jordan Peterson was accused of saying that he wouldn't use his students' preferred pronouns, which he kinda did, and it made him famous. He claims he never said he wouldn't, and frames it as a free speech issue. Kathy Newman, in turn, badly framed this as, why should your right to freedom of speech trump a trans person's right not to be offended? Of course, purposely misgendering someone is not just being offensive, it's harassment, which is something we pretty much all agree is not covered by free speech, or at least should not go unanswered. I've never heard of Douglas Murray, but if the little blurb in Stephen's video is correct, then yeah, he's pretty racist. Terrorism in the Middle East is a complex problem, but it has a lot more to do with politics, economics, and imperialism than it does with which sky wizard they worship. So, simply ignoring those other more important factors and focusing on the cultural paints the picture that there's just something wrong with these brown folks. Like I said before, race functions as you are either white or not. You are a part of Western society, or you're not. You come from a Judeo-Christian culture, or you don't. You are one of us, or you are an outsider. So in this kind of framing, religious differences are being used as a placeholder for racial ones. And if you need a visual representation, just look at the page on Sam Harris's website for the podcast in question that asks, "Is this the end of Europe?" right above a picture of a large group of brown people publicly praying in European streets as though they've taken them over or something. Oh, and Sam Harris engages in all this rhetoric too, so he's totally racist. I'm going to have to do a video on him eventually. But honestly, all of this is beside the point, because Brett and Stephen are both wrong as to how the left functions in the first place. The left can't endorse or control anything. That's actually why the left eating itself is a meme in the first place. See, unlike the right, the left is much more ideologically diverse. The only thing that unifies the left is a desire to progress society forward and see the status quo changed. When you're trying to build something new, everyone has their own take on what it should be and how you should achieve it. On the right, however, the goal is to maintain the status quo, or revert to an older status quo sometimes. This means a lot less variance because everyone kinda knows what they want society to look like it does now, but maybe with fewer brown folks. And people with power and money and influence are far more likely to be on the right, regardless of how they identify, because the status quo got them there, and a change to the status quo might threaten it. And all that power allows them to start think tanks and donate large amounts to politicians so they can endorse and control things in an actually meaningful way. And also allow them to own media companies, like, Spiked Magazine and Learn Liberty.
These are pivotal questions, and here's why Brett thinks the answer to at least most of them is yes.
So the first thing that I recognized a bit before things went haywire at Evergreen, or at least went haywire publicly, was that the people I was talking to, and most of the population at Evergreen is pretty far left, But I recognized that there was a hidden dichotomy between two populations within the left. One of those populations earnestly wishes equality, and there can be some debate over what it is that is being equalized, but virtually everybody on the left would say that they are for equality of opportunity. Then there is another population that does not wish equality of opportunity. What it wishes to do is to turn the tables of oppression. And the problem for us is that when these two populations are intermingled, they sound alike. And the most confusing aspect of it is that the people who are earnestly seeking something like equality of opportunity are unaware that they have signed up with something unholy and un-American.
Now, this is a very interesting claim, and if true, it's arguably the most important political insight of our time.
Oh, please, do tell me how this is a more important observation than economic inequality is driving people to fascism, or we only have 12 years to avoid a climate catastrophe. Weinstein is setting up a false dichotomy here. This is basically the same thing Jordan Peterson talks about with this whole equality of opportunity versus equality of outcome spiel. The idea being that we should have a blank slate mentality with regards to where people of varying groups start off in society, but as soon as we start trying to make it so that disadvantaged groups get a leg up to improve their chances of a better outcome, we're engaging in cultural Marxism. The reason why this is bullshit is that one generation's outcome is the next generation's opportunity. If your grandparents were literally not allowed to live in a nice neighborhood, barred from getting loans because they lived in a shitty one where there were no good jobs that could pay them well and provide them healthcare, so they ate cheap shitty food, got sick, missed work, couldn't afford to send your parents to college even if they did do well in the subpar school that they intended, which meant that even though those nice neighborhoods were technically open to them now, they couldn't afford it, so the cycle repeats, and here you are scraping to survive while some college professor says, whoa, let's not flip the tables of oppression. It would likely make you want to flip some kind of table. In no reality-based world does this person have the same opportunity as the person whose grandparents did get to buy a house in that nice neighborhood. So in order to create real material equality, or something approaching it, turning the tables is going to be necessary, in some sense. Though this is a shit way to present it, since no one is suggesting that white folks need to be enslaved for a few generations to settle the score. Well, someone probably is somewhere, but whatever.
But it raises the immediate question, if this is really the case, then why haven't those who are earnestly pursuing equality of opportunity noticed those who are insidiously pursuing a flip of oppression?
Because it's not what actually is going on.
Well, Brett provides several compelling reasons.
One of the consequences of this dichotomy, the bad actors having taken control of the movement, is that they have begun to erect structures that lead a lot of people to sign up before they really know what it is that they're signing up for. So you'll find across the dialogue of the left at the moment, you'll find words that once upon a time had a definition that you might have struggled a little bit to resurrect it, but you could have figured out what words like equity probably meant. And those words have taken on very different meanings in the present, and they're actually part of a larger structure.
Okay, so let's take these one at a time, never forgetting that everything he is about to say follows from the false dichotomy he's set up. The answer to this is simply that concepts change over time. Let's take his example of equity. Once upon a time, if you were talking about racial equity, you'd probably be referring to the end of slavery. But 100 years later, you finally came to the conclusion that that wasn't good enough. So now when you talk about it, you're referring to the end of Jim Crow and the sorts of things that were passed in the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act. And here you are 50 years later looking around realizing that that wasn't good enough either. So the idea of pushing for racial equity changes. Your goals change. This is how politics work. There's no structure. Knock it off with that vaguely conspiratorial bullshit.
So we have what I would call linguistic booby traps. We have policy proposals on college campuses and elsewhere that are actually Trojan horses that are described as pursuing one thing but actually serve a function other than the one that is on the title page.
Citation needed.
And then we have stigma that is playing an incentivizing role, or actually more correctly, a disincentivizing role. So people like myself who stand up against policy proposals that put my institution in jeopardy find ourselves faced with a social penalty for having done so.
Yeah, don't say ignorant shit. The fact that there are social consequences for the things you say is not some underhanded tactic of an oppressive leftist structure. It's just people reacting to the shit you say. Which is not to say that it can't be taken to an extreme, but if you can't handle a group of students yelling at you, then I don't know, maybe college just isn't right for you.
So to briefly and very simply summarise, Brett argues that the left is currently comprised of two parties. One party that wishes for equality of opportunity, but whose population, at large, is falling for linguistic booby traps and Trojan horses. And a second party that wishes to flip the tables of oppression, and aims to do so by obfuscating language and relying on the first party's lack of attention. Now, if you ask me, that's a good argument.
If it weren't built on a faulty premise, then yeah, I guess.
But before I respond to it, I want to provide what was, in my opinion, the best rebuttal against it, and it came from Brendan.
My answer to the question, is the left eating itself, is no. For the simple reason that what we have on campuses in the US and the UK today is not left. This hyper-racial consciousness, this insistence on female fragility, this paranoid philistinism so that books are defaced with trigger warnings and everything from tabloid newspapers to sexy pop songs can be banned. This disavowal of your own autonomy, your own adulthood, and you're pleading with bureaucracy to provide you with psychic comfort. This use of racial phrases like white men, as if all white men have the same privilege, as if class, the building block of left politics, was irrelevant or such a small thing that it didn't bear talking about. None of this is left.
My answer to the question, is Brendan O'Neill a leftist, is no. For the simple reason that what we have in Spiked magazine today is not left. The lack of racial awareness, this insistence that Brexit is a good thing, this vapid pseudo-intellectualism so that everyone from rapists to anti-Semites to downright fascists can be defended, this disavowal of the politics he props up, this pleading with bureaucracy. Okay, I think you get the picture. Fuck this guy. Seriously, I had honestly never heard of him before this, and I wish I could go back in time. He's a reactionary in Marxist clothing, and he pisses me off because he's actually pretty good at it. He plays the class reductionist, acting as though all other societal structures don't matter, but engages almost exclusively in identity politics, while almost never speaking substantively about class. It's a pretty good smokescreen, until you realize it's just smoke. Or, to put it in Brendan's words,
I know they call themselves left, but North Korea calls itself a democratic republic. People lie. And more importantly, people use progressive phrases to disguise reactionary agendas.
I couldn't have said it better myself.
Now, within this speech, Brendan does a fantastic job of emphasising that something is eating the left, and makes a reasonable case for why we shouldn't consider it left. But in doing so, he makes quite clear, to me at least, that him and Brett are on the same side in all but name. They both see the problem, but they disagree on what to call it.
Stephen is quite right here. Brett and Brendan are on the same side in all but name. He probably should have presented what the other two panel members said, since they're the ones who actually differ. Well, he did talk about Angus Johnston in a follow-up video titled Censored Speech Debunked, and if I cover it in detail, we'll be here forever, but I'll have to touch on it. But first, I'd like to start with Laura Kipnis. In her opening statement, she deconstructs the entire exercise here in a way that I found, well, enlightening.
Well, in answer to the question posed, I'm also going to say provisionally no. I thought I was going to be the first one to say no. If by left we mean broadly anti-capitalist, and if by eating itself we mean broadly the free speech on campus issue, which I take to be the subtext here. I'm saying no, though for a while, even recently, I might have said yes. As someone whom others have tried to shut up, I should naturally endorse the free speech agenda, both out of self-interest and because politically I favor freedom and disfavor authoritarianism. As a leftist myself, that is, an anti-capitalist, I have to start by acknowledging the correctness of the premise that there's basically no such thing as free speech. There's no free marketplace of ideas because some idea mongers have more purchasing power than others or a better position in the idea marketplace. Markets don't produce equality and never have. In fact, they produce massive inequality. Look around. Check out some wealth and income distribution data. In this context, I do find it difficult to deny that the free speech argument is a comforting illusion, a cover for the fact that powerful interests determine who can speak and who gets heard and by how many. As a supposed free speech advocate, I myself have been the beneficiary of numerous speaking invites, sometimes with quite nice honoraria attached, to events where there are not infrequently lavish catered dinners where you get served expensive things like filet mignon. Because I came to realize the free speech agenda is a well-funded one, with various foundations, often libertarian/conservative ones, funneling money from donors whose politics align in not uncomplicated ways, i.e. anti-regulatory economic policies, with this idea and not other ideas. The other ideas don't get the filet mignon.
That right there is where she almost sticks the landing. I mean, she's just so close to realizing that the next thing she should ask is, why do you think that these agendas align so well? Followed by, hey Brett, how much money have libertarian billionaires donated to your magazine? This, however, is where she drops the ball.
Look, I fully believe there's a fatal anti-intellectualism sweeping American campuses that has to be addressed, and much of it revolves around identity politics and campus cultures that increasingly favor feelings over intellect. When I see videos of demonstrators at Evergreen or Wesleyan saying they don't need to read books because we know what our experiences have been, and shouting down faculty, I too want to blame identity politics. But that's to be as simplistic as the students who want to shut people up who offend or trigger them. Instead, we on campus, and I mean faculty, have to help students get over the theory versus experience dichotomy and understand that experience in itself, by itself, is meaningless. The only way to make sense of it is with distance and retrospect.
This statement reminded me of another video she did for Learn Liberty that expands on what she's talking about here.
So I don't want things that offend me to have power over me. I want to have power over them, which I think means having intellectual distance and using my intellect as a distancing tool.
What she's missing is that the fact that she's able to do this, and so am I when it comes to certain things, is a form of privilege we experience. Not everyone can mentally distance themselves from things that upset them because those things represent real, systemic, and material problems that they experience on a daily basis. She brings it home in the end, though, but we'll get to that. Here's what I saw as the through line in Angus's opening statement.
We're obviously in a moment of incredible crisis as a country, right? And I will confess that I find the idea that white male is a useless or amorphous category a little confusing in a time when Donald Trump is the president of the United States, an aficionado and a maestro of white male identity politics, right? This is a moment in history when the politics of white male identity are not only ascendant but weaponized, right? And I think we do have a difficulty here that goes back to the way in which we conceptualize civil liberties. I'm an ACLU guy, I'm a First Amendment absolutist guy, and as I was growing up, right, thinking about the concept of free speech, the place you would always go was Skokie, right? That was the example that you would always give. That if you really were for free speech, you had to be for the free speech of the Nazis in Skokie. And the way that was formulated was that to be for free speech means to be most of all for the free speech of the people that you hate the most. And the people that you hate the most are the Nazis, so that's where you go. I think that's wrong. I think that to be for free speech means that you have to be for the free speech the most of the people whose free speech is most under attack, right? If the people that you hate the most are relatively privileged in terms of having the ability to avail themselves of their First Amendment rights, then they're not the people that you need to be supporting the most. The people you need to be supporting most are the people who are the most under attack. We talk a lot right now about the free speech movement at Berkeley in 1964, particularly when Yiannopoulos was coming to campus, right? And he was being thrown off campus and people were rioting against him. Everybody was talking about how all of this was a betrayal of the principles of the free speech movement at Berkeley. And, you know, I'm a historian of student activism. I believe powerfully in that moment and that movement. It's one of the places that I think of American students as being truly heroic. But the crucial moment, right, the crucial historical moment in the free speech movement at Berkeley was that speech that Mario Savio gave. Right, the most famous speech in the history of American student activism, the cornerstone speech of the Berkeley free speech movement, literally a speech that has been inscribed in stone. And the peroration of that speech, the climax of that speech, is this paragraph. There comes a time when the operation of the machine becomes so odious, makes you so sick at heart that you can't take part. You can't even passively take part. And you've got to put your bodies upon the gears and upon the wheels, upon the levers, upon all the apparatus, and you've got to make it stop. And you've got to indicate to the people who run it, to the people who own it, that unless you're free, the machine will be prevented from working at all. This is not the language of a man who wants to sit down and debate the people who he is opposed to. This is not the language of a man who is insisting that the people who are oppressing him need to be given a forum. And I think that we on the left need to make at least some sort of an effort to reach out to the people who are also on the left, who are putting their bodies upon the wheels and upon the gears and upon the levers right now.
Now, when Stephen responded to Angus, he focused on the bit about Nazis and how Angus correctly points out that being focused on the free speech of those with the most hateful ideas does not necessarily a free speech advocate make. Stephen used this to put forth his views on freedom of speech, and while I could make a whole other video about it, he basically believes in the marketplace of ideas. He sums up his views as,
"The way we rid the world of bad ideas is not by silencing them, it's by discussing them."
No, it's not. We rid the world of bad ideas by rejecting them. We rid the world of bad ideas by fighting them. Politics is not about persuasion. It is about power. And if you had actually listened to Angus, you would have heard that. For the average person with no meaningful access to a platform, their freedom to say whatever they like doesn't mean much with regards to their material reality. But their right to join with others and throw their bodies upon all the apparatus and make it stop, that means everything. That is power. Treating politics like a debating society essentially abdicates that power so that those with more individual forms of power can slowly cook the planet to death. Freedom of speech is great. I love it. But it takes a backseat to our right to stand as a collective and declare that we're not going to take this hateful and oppressive shit anymore. Not because it offends our delicate sensibilities, but because it's actually dangerous. In fact, Laura put it quite well, I think.
At the same time, all speech and all ideas don't have a place on campus. There are intellectual standards to be maintained and principles to uphold, and most importantly, the most important one is that campuses are inclusive places, not venues to debate whether blacks or Muslims or trans students deserve social equality. Those debates have been settled. If student Republicans want to invite alt-right and edgy neo-fascist speakers, they can invite them to off-campus venues. If it were 1932, would we invite Joseph Goebbels to campus to debate whether Jews and homosexuals should be removed from Germany on the principle that good speech will obviously trump bad speech? and all ideas deserve a hearing? No, and campus presidents should not be doling out hundreds of thousands of dollars in security costs to protect idiots with ignominious ideas that are opposed to our core values.
Preach, sister. That is exactly why Nazi shit should not be covered under free speech. Full stop. Anyway, back to the Rationality Rules video.
So, where exactly do I stand on this one? Well, at the present, I'm with Brett. I'm currently convinced that the left is indeed eating itself, and while I hold this position for all the same reasons as Brett, my primary reason was ironically conveyed by Brendan later in the debate.
I think what we have to recognize is that on campus right now, we face something far worse than left versus left or left versus right, or the alt-right coming in and stirring things up, and left-wing people crying as a consequence. We face a generation that has been schooled to reject Enlightenment thought, schooled to reject due process, schooled to reject freedom of speech, schooled to reject the ideal of autonomy, and encouraged to see themselves as fragile and weak and requiring bureaucratic therapeutic scaffolding in every area of their lives. That is not left. That is the opposite of left. That is the opposite of radical, and it needs to be challenged by everyone who seriously considers themselves to be a left-wing person.
You see, I've literally lost sleep over this observation. My generation and those after have indeed been schooled to reject Enlightenment thought, and yet most of my generation considers themselves left.
So first, I have to reject Brendan's assertion here. Students coming together to wield collective power and force, not plead with, those in authority to change their policies to better represent the will of the student body are hardly the actions of people who view themselves as weak and fragile. Second, the Enlightenment was bomb as fuck. Like, it was seriously an awesome step forward. But let's not act as though principles set forth 300 years ago are somehow the end-all be-all of how to run a society. Besides, questioning the status quo, holding those in power accountable for their statements and actions, and telling off fascists is not rejecting Enlightenment values. That's a bit alarmist. If you're losing sleep over this, it shouldn't be from those of our generation on the left. It should be from those on the right who are flirting with fascism. See Umberto Eco for more.
And so while I think Brendan's correct when he says that prioritising offence over free speech and censoring opposing views is not liberal, I'm not so certain that it's not left.
You know, I thought that Stephen was actually going to conflate liberalism with leftism, but color me surprised. You are correct, Stephen. Though, in sharing Brendan's framing, you are misunderstanding the difference. The only reason we conflate liberalism with leftism is that 300 years ago it was to the left of feudalism, and 100 years ago FDR reclaimed the term to help his New Deal policies seem less radical, which is why no one in my country actually understands the definition of the word anymore. Liberalism currently is the center. Liberals can lean left or right, but they are centrist in the sense that they don't want to fundamentally change the underlying social and economic structures. While liberalism is focused on individual rights, leftists tend to care more about collective rights, so a more accurate way to put that statement would be prioritizing the collective right not to be subject to harmful speech over an individual's right to speak freely.
Sure, it's definitely not left in the classical sense.
Oh, never mind, he is conflating liberalism with the left.
But the question is it left in the current sense? Or to ask this question obliquely, does a considerable proportion of the left, that being primarily its younger generations, favour regressive policies?
I would like to declare that with this statement, the term regressive has now officially been more overused than neoliberal.
For example, do a considerable proportion of young US Democrats favour silencing opposing views? Yes, they do.
Utilizing collective power to prevent harmful speech is not necessarily the same as silencing opposing views, and depriving someone of a platform is not silencing them. To what point is this behavior supposed to regress us?
Do a considerable proportion of Remainers, who are overwhelmingly left, insist on a second referendum because they don't like the democratic result of the first?
The British people have spoken? No, they haven't.
Yes, they do.
Brexit is dumb and you guys shouldn't do it. Believe me, if across the pond we were able to call a redo on our big fuck-up of 2016, we'd do it. And again, to what point is this supposed to regress us?
and hence, because these people represent a considerable proportion of the modern left, the left is indeed eating itself. It's at civil war, and it's about time, to echo Brendan's sentiment, that those who are falling for these booby traps, which may or may not include yourself, realise this. The classical left really does face a serious threat, and we, can no longer afford to ignore it. Anyhow, what are your thoughts?
My thoughts are this. The classical left is a contradiction in terms. What once was the left is now the center. And if there is any type of civil war going on, it's between the left and the right, while you centrists sit around debating civility politics and refusing to pick a side until one is chosen for you. So, I said at the beginning that I think this video is indicative of how Stephen approaches these things. For starters, he used material put out by sources with a clear bias that he either didn't notice, ignored, or chose not to point out. He failed to recognize Brendan as the bad faith actor that he is, though I do maintain he is quite good at it, and sucked up and repeated the most right-wing arguments that were made. In fact, he quite literally only presented the conspiratorial and right-wing side of this discussion. Even in his follow-up video where he did address Angus's part, he focused on the slice about Nazi free speech instead of taking it holistically, and ignored Laura's part about how Nazi shit is actually a threat, which was a far more clear statement on the matter. And this is what he does. He failed to recognize Ben Shapiro for the bad faith actor that he is, somehow not recognizing the ridiculously shitty debate tactics he uses. The same is true for Stefan Molyneux. In one of his earliest videos, he takes on Molyneux's ridiculous theory of universally preferable behavior. It's a solid takedown, but he basically just repeats a blog made by Luke Muehlhauser over at Common Sense Atheism. Not that he was trying to hide that fact, he links to it and quotes it multiple times. The mask-off moment came at the beginning of the video.
But, despite the fact that I quite enjoy a lot of Molyneux's work, a bad argument is a bad argument.
What? Honestly, I might have let it slide if he said he liked some of Stefan's work. I'm sure somewhere he's made a video that's not fascist propaganda. Somewhere. But he said most. And this is Stefan fucking Molyneux we're talking about. Later in the video, he makes this statement.
You know, it's strange, because Molyneux is a very articulate and educated person. But when it comes to arguments, he's just awful.
Yeah, and there are conclusions that you should have drawn from that. He's a bullshit artist. The veneer of eloquence is there to cover up the fact that he just makes shit up, and it is well documented that he does that. To be fair... This video was 3 years ago, and in his rebuttal to Stefan's response, he does make him look like the gibbering idiot he is, so I can only hope he's come around on Molyneux. But the fact remains that in all three videos where he chose to debunk Molyneux, he chose to go after his dry and obviously stupid theory of ethics rather than the bigoted shit he props up with it. He did the same thing with Jordan Peterson.
Colin asks, I like what Jordan Peterson says on almost everything except religion and morality. This puts me in a bind as I want to bring others' attention to him, but doing so might bring more attention to these absurd views. Do you think Jordan's overall effect is positive or negative? So first off, join the club. The amount of people I've spoken to who value Jordan Peterson, they like what he has to say, except for on the topic of morality and religion, is staggering. It's a hell of a lot of people, and to a large extent I consider myself among them. But as for your primary question, which is do I think Jordan Peterson is a force for good? I'm not sure. I'm not sure is probably the best answer I can give. He's causing people to have discussions about topics that are very interesting and not adequately addressed. But when he talks about them, it's quite bad. When it comes to his positions on SJWs, on free speech, I'm with him, and I think he's doing a fantastically good job.
Like with Molyneux, the fact that his takes on morality and religion are a garbled, inconsistent mess, something you've made numerous videos on, should tell you something about his approach to politics. And beyond that, the horrible, disingenuous, pseudo-intellectual horseshit of the Jeep is well documented. He talks completely out of his ass when it comes to most subjects.
Problem is that the left is creating this environment in which people like Ben Shapiro and Jordan Peterson are put on stilts as if they are supremely intellectual, when they're not. And people think that that extends to other domains of discourse, and it doesn't.
It's not the left that's doing this, it's Barry fucking Weiss. Look at these fuckers. Who do you think is benefiting from their work? Because it ain't the left. The left is not a monolith, and even if it were, we've barely recovered from neoliberalism. You have got to stop making the left out to be a boogeyman when we've only recently managed to get a hold of a piece of the culture.
While I consider myself a disciple of Sam, he is far beyond me. He's a very, very intelligent individual. I think he will be remembered long after almost everyone alive today is gone. He will be a case of someone who wasn't really appreciated as much as he should have been in his time, in my opinion.
Oh boy. No, I can't. Sam Harris is a whole separate topic, and if I keep covering YouTube atheists like this, I'll need to eventually do a whole video on him. He's their favorite daddy. So let's come back to the present, to the current troubles surrounding Stephen. On March 29th, 2019, he put out a video titled The Athletic Advantage of Transgender Women and Why It's Unfair. And like I said, this caused yet another rift in the YouTube skeptic community. Some, probably better people than me, handled this with more tact, but I'm just going to call this video what it is. A pile of transphobic sheep shit. Essence of Thought put out an excellent video debunking Stephen's abject wrongness on the subject, and if you've ever been on the internet, you'll know that harassment began flying around, more in one direction than the other, and tempers flared and people took sides. It was ugly, and there are some YouTube skeptics that disappointed me, but I can take some small comfort in the fact that there are some who might have made this series that have earned a pass for being on the right side. The right side is trans rights, by the way. Anyway, as Ethel over Essence of Thought pointed out, Stephen mixes data on cis men with data on trans women who are physiologically quite different, and
the impact of anti-androgens on these physical attributes is well known, something the most rudimentary glance at the research on the topic should have shown you.
This means that, like the obvious bias of Learn Liberty and Spiked Magazine, Ben Shapiro's shitty debate tactics, and Jordan Peterson's lack of any fucking sense, he either didn't notice, ignored it, or chose not to share it. Now, I don't see how he could be this blatantly wrong in the science without him just really wanting it to fit a pre-existing belief that trans women are actually men, and it's fine to let them believe that they're women as long as that doesn't adversely affect real women, never mind the fact that trans women in women's sports doesn't adversely affect cis women, and that attitude is transphobic. And to be clear, I'm not angry because Stephen has transphobic views. I mean, most people didn't know that trans folks were actually a thing 10 years ago, so we pretty much all have some transphobic thoughts and feelings, and the same goes for sexist, racist, and homophobic thoughts and feelings as well. It's a societal issue, so these things are sort of baked into our mental pie, but we do have a responsibility to try to be aware of them and do what we can to correct them when we see them in ourselves and others. So what I'm angry about is the fact that he refused to take the video down, seriously dragged his feet on a correction video that corrected others more than himself, and made a dejected puppy dog-eyed martyr video when the atheist community of Austin distanced themselves from him, the thumbnail of which literally features Galileo with his head photoshopped on. Dude, you got owned. All you had to do to avoid this shitstorm was apologize, which he did, but he tried to absolve himself of blame in a number of ways, take down the video, promptly correct it, then spend some time in self-reflection. It wouldn't have magically fixed everything, but it would have shown some goodwill on your part. And it wouldn't have been difficult either, since Ethel already did most of the work for you. Whew. Alright. My inner SJW is satisfied. I will acknowledge that he has taken steps to correct this. You should watch his correction video after Ethel's, which is cringily titled The Mistakes of Many. Yeah, he's trying to take responsibility, but only the bare minimum. The video does contain a gem or two, though.
Laurel is a woman. Period.
I'm glad that you acknowledge that trans women are women. Hopefully, going forward, you will act as though you believe that. Intentions don't count for much. Anyway, the crux of what I'm trying to get at, and I may be misrepresenting Stephen here, is that I think that he thinks that, for the most part at least, he eschews ideology. I say this because it's a thing that his favorite daddy Sam Harris prides himself on, and Stephen is very much like Sam Harris. I think daddy would be proud, and that's not a compliment, but I'm sure he'd take it as one. Both Woodford and Harris take great pains to seem neutral and objective, to deal only in the facts, so that they may come to know the truth. It sounds noble, but what often happens is that you come to think, ever so subtly, that what you believe must be factual. You came to these beliefs via the facts, so how could it be any other way? You might assume that people echoing what you already believe about free speech are acting in good faith. You may also assume that even though certain people may espouse some ridiculous beliefs, that the beliefs you share with them don't merit reassessment because you came to them logically, even if those certain people didn't. You may even look at studies, at hard data, and just not see what doesn't fit your assumptions. In an ironic twist, by trying to control your biases, you can just become unconsciously ruled by them. Stephen, both you and Sam are centrist ideologues. You may think that you've forgone ideology, or that it plays only a small role in your thinking, but you have an ideology, and it is strong, and it's being shifted to the right. I said earlier that the real distinction between the left and the right is that the right wants to maintain or regress the status quo, while the left seeks to progress it forward. Well, by definition, the center seeks to also maintain, or at best reform, the status quo. As an aside, the vast majority of the American Democratic Party are centrists, so centrists are inherently more susceptible to right-wing ideas, since their goals are more likely to align. And while a somewhat resurgent left is pulling the center in its direction in some places, the fascists are literally back, and that's not hyperbole. So if you truly are a liberal, and I definitely believe you on that front, then the real threat to you and the Enlightenment values you cherish is not coming from the left. We actually really like that shit. Like a lot. The threat's coming from the right.
Whenever I hear people who are fantastic in one area speak about politics, or sometimes just an area where they're not so fantastic or not so well known, it tends to be devastating.
Yeah, I know. At any rate, that's enough on Woodford. I doubt this will be the last video I make on him. He has plans to keep fighting on this trans athletics thing, and those of us on the other side aren't giving up the fight either, nor should we. So, like if you liked this, subscribe if you want to see more, support me on Patreon if you sold your labor for enough today, and share if you know someone who doesn't know the difference between left and liberal. Alright, I'm gonna vacuum my apartment. It's actually embarrassing how long it's been since I've done that.